I live in a small town with an even smaller population. We're pretty isolated. A lot of the locals think there's no way this could have been anything but a large animal, or something like that. But I knew better. I'd already read some cryptid stories before, and heard about the possibility of it being something else besides the usual predators. You see, something was killing the dogs. 3 of them in the town so far. If it had been livestock, hell, even chickens, there would have been concern, but dogs, man's best friend, is a whole different ballgame. And these weren't your Hollywood-type chihuahua or purse pups. We're talking full-sized working dogs that could be mistaken for a wolf. So, action needed to be taken. The first 2 were killed in their yards, torn, ripped apart. The third was in the nearby woods. You see, these folk were positive. Whatever creature was doing it must live in this vast expanse of woods that bordered our town. Whatever it was, must live real deep into them, as nobody could think of something they'd seen or hunted, especially no dens or anything. Of course, a few men and their dogs went out to go hunting, so far deep they needed to camp out overnight. One of the men is meant to keep watch, and of course, he falls asleep. Find the dogs at his feet is no longer there. Just a bloody leash. No sign whatsoever of the dog or the predator. Nobody heard a thing. The man is enraged and also adamant that he hadn't just dozed off, and the others were inclined to believe him. They grabbed their flashlights and guns and headed further, deeper into the woods, towards the caverns which had been condemned years ago due to being extremely unsafe from rock falls. They get to almost the furthest they can possibly go without risking their lives when the remaining dogs begin howling and whining, all together like some sort of wolf pack. The men can't budge. They just all stood in a circle, howling, whining, when all of a sudden, there was a noise like a crackling from one of the caves, like something snapped, and those dogs ran from their owners, raced all the way back to camp. The men chased the dogs, and they didn't want to stick around either. They all loaded up their stuff, and as soon as it was light enough to move out, they got out of there. Those dogs, they were hunting dogs, working animals who were only afraid of their master. We're talking about bloodhounds, blue heelers, German shepherds even. Dogs that are designed for this. But they were all terrified. And although I wasn't part of that group of men, I know everything they saw was true. As the man that fell asleep, who said that would never happen, that was my dad. I believe everything he said. There's something deep in those dens in the caves. I know there's something, but we can't get down there. It makes me shudder to think what it could be. I was out hunting in Denton County, Texas, and I just shot a beautiful 8-point buck. Was taking it back to my truck when something large, black, and large as a man, fast-moving crossed the path about 20 feet in front of me, leaving 2 gigantic blobs of mud behind it. It didn't stop running until it was out of my sight line and back behind the trees in front. I could hear it sort of panting. I'd been hunting for 20 years and never seen anything like it. But I also come from a long line of hunters, and when I was a kid, my grandpappy used to tell a tale of Old Lenny, a huge black creature he once mistook for a bear. Apparently, the story goes that he shot at this thing until he'd ran out of bullets. But even then, it didn't go down. It just kept running. And the only evidence Grandpappy had was that it had even been there were several piles of dung. Of course, all his buddies thought he had had too much moonshine, but he always swore he'd find Old Lenny again one day. He's long since passed, but as I quickly reloaded my shotgun, I knew I had to try and get that thing, to prove to people he was telling the truth. I ran after it, into the trees where I could still hear it. It was still pretty early in the morning, roughly 6 a.m. The sun wasn't fully yet risen, so the woods were still somewhat dark, especially in the tree coverage under the canopy. But being experienced and having already bagged me a kill, I had my vision binoculars with me. I put them on, and as I ran into the trees, gun locked and loaded, and ready to shoot, I saw this thing. Now, they were an expensive piece of technology, one that had never failed me before. I enjoyed a hunt in the dark, so am fully used to them. But the strangest thing was, despite seeing that thing run into the trees and hearing it panting, the goggles didn't pick up a thing. I could hear it breathing not too far away, although it seemed to be moving again as the sounds kept coming from various directions. The goggles didn't pick up a thing. I even took them off to see if I could find the creature with my eyes, rather than relying on what had to be somehow flawed technology. But it was as if this thing had just somehow blended in with the surroundings. I'm usually a patient guy, but I was all riled up. Not being to find this thing was making me mighty angry. I yelled something out at it, not expecting any kind of response since, after all, it was highly unlikely this creature could understand. But then, suddenly, it rushed me. One moment there was nothing. Next, old Lenny was about to tackle me, so I began shooting. I knew I got him at least a few times, as I'm a sure shot, but much like then, I stood there for a moment, collecting myself when I noticed the same piles. Piles of feces, not mud. It had been old Lenny, at least an old Lenny Jr., but does nothing to explain why it was defecating. I've heard all nature of weird creatures, but one that defecates? What could that even be? I mean, is that usual behavior for a Bigfoot or a creature like this? I was on a camping trip with my dad. We were in the middle of nowhere, and it was pretty late at night. I awoke from a strange dream that felt very real. The sun had set, and it was very dark outside, almost black, except for the bright stars that were above us. I could hear crickets chirping nearby. My dad was one of those very lucky guys who can sleep basically anywhere through anything, so he was still snoring. I considered trying to wake him for a moment, as despite knowing it had to have been a dream. I'm still feeling very uneasy and unnerved. Something was off. But I also felt silly for being scared from just a dream. It was pretty warm in the tent, so despite feeling anxious, I unzipped the opening, going outside. We'd set up a sort of den area just in front of the actual tent. Some camping chairs, a cooler. I sat in one of the chairs and grabbed a bottle of water, which, whilst no longer cold, was still refreshing, just to quench thirst. I was starting to feel a little better. The dream was fading, and the cool air was helping too. I just sat there, surprisingly comfortable chair, looking up at the stars, listening to my father snore, and the occasional chirps or rustling from critters and the nearby trees. Of course, the inevitable happened, and once I had finished the water, I had to pee. Despite being a couple of guys, we had standards, and one of those was you don't pee close to the tent. Common decency, right? So, I grabbed the flashlight, head over to the spot we designated the John, not too far from the camp, but far enough away that it didn't stink, and we weren't likely to step in it. Of course, these things always happen mid-flow. Those feelings from after midnight came rushing back, and all of a sudden, I was filled with this inexplicable sense of dread. As soon as I stood there, shorts around my knees, I felt something that would probably have made my bladder go loose if I hadn't already been peeing. A hot breath on the back of my neck, and a foul odor, like something unwashed and rotting. I felt it again, so hot and heavy. I actually felt some of the hair on my neck move, and the smell worsened. Gone off meat and unflushed toilets. And as I stood there trembling, thinking I was going to end up as something's dinner, someone's plaything. I heard my dad yell out to me. My heart leapt, and I heard a crunch behind me, like something heavy stepping on leaves and branches, as I could no longer feel the hot breath. I whipped around, the flashlight there, but nothing. I ran back to the tent, my shorts still around my ankles. These days we laugh about it, and my dad likes to remind me of how I flew embarrassingly fast into the tent, half naked and crying. Probably just suggested I scared myself. But I can't shake that feeling. Something large enough to be able to breathe onto me. Something that accompanied with the smell of death. And something fast enough to disappear out of sight within seconds. There's no way I imagine that. It was roughly 1 a.m., August 21st, 2013. My buddy Joey, 24, and I were heading out to our favorite moon-watching spot in the North Maine woods. We had been to this area many times and had some weird happenings, but nothing like this encounter. It's nice out there. It's completely dark. If you ever try stargazing or moon spotting in the suburbs, you won't get to see the true beauty of the sky. All the streetlights and light pollution really disguise the moon in the sky. But out there, it was total darkness. You can't even see your hand in front of your face. Not without flashlights. We'd seen lights in the sky that moved way too fast to be stars or aircraft. We'd experienced loss of time and our phones, watches, anything digital losing power, despite being fully charged. But we'd never seen anything like this. First off, we'd never actually seen another person or anything out there. It was always just us two. So, we were more than surprised to see evidence that anybody else was out there. We could hear a low rumbling noise that we just could not quite place. And there was definitely a light source that had never been there before. That was when we also realized we could smell smoke. The light source must have been a campfire, which was really odd. The whole time we'd been going there, since we were kids really, we'd never known of anybody camping out in that spot. It just seemed odd. We headed over to where it seemed to be coming from, and then we saw it. Now, I don't know exactly to know what we were expecting to see. Part of me thinks we want to believe I was hoping for adventure scouts. Another part knows I was secretly wishing for a UFO and little green men sitting around it. What we actually saw in many ways was even more bizarre and hard to explain. You see, there were what looked to be 3 figures. 2 looked real tall, like maybe 7 feet, and the third maybe 5 or so feet, smaller. They were naked as far as we could tell, and although they were partly in shadow, as the only light around them was very dim, we couldn't tell if they were male or female. To put it politely, you couldn't see any obvious parts. They seemed to be androgynous. Now, you may be wondering, couldn't we tell from their faces? Well, that was actually the weirdest part. Their heads were covered, and so far as we could tell, there wasn't even any eye holes or anything. They never moved. They were just standing there. We stood and watched them for maybe 10 minutes or so, and they never moved. Never even said a thing. In the end, we were really freaked out. We just left. It was far too weird to even explain.